Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. I am slightly regretting letting my daughter decorate my computer with stickers. She even put my name up the side there. I thought nobody will ever see it because the video is up there in the front. But now I have that computer facing my wife's computer, and here we are. Well, now I'm sorry if this is a bit of a mess. This is my painting studio. Just over here I've got canvases with paint on them and an easel and things with paint. This box here is full of paint. This box is full of paint. A box you can't see is full of paint. So I'm sorry if that's a mess. You're not supposed to see that. And these cords are not supposed to be here. I've just got them set up because the computer's here. This is all supposed to be presentable behind me. I'm sorry if it's a mess. However, we are doing a really important video right now. We're doing Roy Child's Open Letter to Ayn Rand, which was published in 1969. And Roy Childs died in 1992. He's not around anymore for us to talk to, but we're going to reply to him for whatever benefit anarchists today might get from it, and what benefit you might get from it, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we get to skip to 3 minutes and 12 seconds. We can skip his opening remarks, and we're going to start here.
One of the major characteristics of your conception of government is that it holds a monopoly on the use of retaliatory force in a given geographical area.
One of the characteristics of Ayn Rand's government is that it holds a geographical monopoly.
There are only two possible kinds of monopolies.
Now, there are two kinds of monopolies, right? There's a coercive monopoly. What's a coercive monopoly? NASA used to be one, but then they passed laws and now other people can make rockets or whatever the thing was. So one type of monopoly is coercive, where the government says you cannot do this. So that's one type of monopoly. What's the other type? Well, that would be a voluntary monopoly or a merit monopoly, like Apple's. Apple gets to sell iPhones because nobody else can make anything as good as an iPhone. Now, you could take Apple's monopoly away if you could make a better phone cheaper. You don't have to make iPhones. You have to make something better than an iPhone and cost less than the iPhone to take away their monopoly on iPhones. So there are two types of monopoly, and it's not a full monopoly. I know there are other people selling phones. But examples could be made in the free market. There are companies that sell virtually 100% of a given thing. De Beers comes to mind. That's a question that goes into the global sphere, and that's not really that's not really meaningful for the word monopoly, because a monopoly concerns what happens inside of a given economic system. We're asking whether the United States government interferes in the economy in a certain way or does not. If it does not interfere in the economy in a certain way, then that monopoly that we're speaking about is a voluntary monopoly or a merit monopoly. If the government does interfere in the economy in the case that we're talking about, then we would call it a coercive monopoly.
Monopoly, which initiates force to keep its monopoly, or a non-coercive monopoly, which is always open to competition. In an objectivist society, the government is not open to competition, and hence is a coercive monopoly.
In an objectivist society, the government is not open to competition and is therefore a coercive monopoly. All right, let's just stop right there, buddy, because you just talked about a monopoly applying to the government itself. Now that doesn't make any sense, because everything we just said defining monopolies assumes that there's a government. Now, which is it? Do monopolies apply to government? Is that a concept that applies to governments? Or is monopolies a concept that occurs once we've established a government? Because you didn't make any indication in either of your definitions that there's anything like a monopoly in government. You said that there are two types of monopoly, one in which the government coerces and one in which there is no coercion. Both of those occur underneath a system of government. Now you're saying that a government itself is a monopoly. Well, then where do monopolies occur? Do they occur under governments or not? So you're going to have to return to your two previous points of what is a coercive and a non-coercive monopoly, and define them again in the context of monopoly being a government. Because it's not. A monopoly is not a government. A monopoly is behavior that occurs once you establish a government. Shall we continue? Maybe we need to move forward a bit. Okay. I came up with an analogy, which isn't a great analogy, but maybe it's better than I think it is. I'm going to share it with you. Government is kind of like a wild animal. Now, this analogy is not particularly apt, but it's just fun to think about for a second. The government is a wild animal, and you were born inside of its corral. Now, it's like a lizard. Lizards and toads can only see motion. And they only have one reaction to motion, which is to try to grab it with their tongues. They can only see certain types of motion. They literally cannot see. If everything's holding still in front of them, their brain processes nothing and they see nothing. They only see motion. So says science. Well, what if you were born inside of a wild animal's cage? And if anybody tries to crawl into that cage, it attracts the wild animal's attention and it goes over and snaps them up. And if anybody tries to crawl out, it goes over and snaps them up. And in fact, if you run around inside the cage raising too much ruckus, it will see you and snap you up. But as long as you're quiet, and as long as you don't raise any ruckus, it will leave you alone. Now, do I advocate that situation? No, I'm just letting you think about this a little bit. That's just a non-apt, clumsy, stupid metaphor that I came up with as I was thinking about these things. And it's kind of a useful metaphor because government sort of is like a wild animal. There really is not any person at the helm. There is no single individual person. There are only groups of individuals that come and go and have temporary careers in the government, sometimes just for a year or two, some of them. And the government is made up of this mass of turmoil that changes over time. So there's not any single individual for us to even refer to in a government. So it is like some sort of wild animal that we have to deal with. And it does go crazy when somebody tries to get inside of the cage, and it will not let anybody out of the cage except under certain special conditions, like you have to get a plane ticket, and to get a plane ticket you have to have an ID, and to get an ID you have to have a passport, and you can't carry any more than a certain amount of cash, and this wild animal will go crazy. Now, I don't advocate all that. I'm not saying that all of the laws in place today should be. I'm just trying to make us have a way to think about government. It's like a guard dog that's dangerous to everybody in the house. So if you go out in the yard, you go a certain way and through a certain path to get out, and hopefully the thieves that come and try to break in don't realize that there's a secret path. So, alright, shall we continue? 3 minutes and 45 seconds. That's just a little bit, so I'll let him talk.
The quickest way of showing why it must either initiate force or cease being a government is the following. Suppose that I were distraught with the service of a government in an objectivist society. Suppose that I judged, being as rational as I possibly could, that I could secure the protection of my contracts and the retrieval of stolen goods at a cheaper price and with more efficiency.
Alright, let's assume that you are a guy in an economy and you say, I could do this cheaper. The police cost too much money because, they spend too much money on new cars. They should buy used cars. And the jail, they just put new cladding on the side of the jail down there. That wasn't necessary. I could do protection cheaper for myself. Alright, the problem with that is you're going to have to convince everybody around you in society to change because they've all agreed on this together and they all have written the laws together according to their elected representatives going and spending much time writing these laws. And there's a body of laws that those policemen that are driving around in those expensive cruisers and those jails over there are enforcing. There's a body of laws that's been written consensually. Now, if you think that it's a matter of economics to decide that you could get it cheaper in some other way, then you're missing out on the idea of what an economy is. The economy is the activities of people in a given geographic area underneath a given government. Now, we've already gone over the fact that he doesn't understand what a government is. He doesn't understand what a monopoly is. He's got the two conflated. So how would he then understand the current point that we're on about establishing your own government just because you think that you could save a few dollars? Well, they didn't establish this government in order to be economic. They established the government in order to be free. Now that they're free, they can go about doing things in an economic way, and maybe trying to establish a monopoly or not. But they can't do that until they establish a government. So he wants to do economic things and question whether or not they are monopolies, which are things that happen underneath the government. He wants to do those before he builds a government. Now this is putting the cart before the horse in the most severe way. So we see that getting your philosophy right and understanding philosophy and being able to think is important to these issues. And just waving your hand and saying, oh, philosophy is not important, I'm just going to do economics. We're going to see how he gets in quite a mess in just a minute here by hand-waving and dismissing and saying, all of that's unnecessary, all we need is this. And he's got a very simple little this that he gets to. But let's go forward, shall we? Where are we now? 345. Alright, so he's saying that what if somebody wants to do it cheaper, so they set up their competing government to do it cheaper. Now, if Ayn Rand's objectivist government goes in and stops them, then it's initiating force. I don't agree with that. I believe that the very second you say, I'm going to have men with guns and armored cars, and I'm going to have a jail, and I'm going to have a court, I believe as soon as you start saying that, you're initiating force against the current order that you live under. Now, you can either elect representatives to change the laws you see fit, maybe make sure that they buy used police cars or something, or you can move the hell out of the country. But you can't just have a revolution, because there are laws against that, and they will put you in jail as a traitor. So that, it's such a fantasy, unicorns pooping rainbows world he lives in. He says, well, let's be economic about it. Economics is the science of what people do inside of a nation. Right? There's no economics in a state of anarchy. There's only production if people have some sort of stability. But if your stuff can be stolen any minute by anybody and it's just constant warfare, we know what that's like. That was Europe in the Dark Ages. We know what it's like. Sure, people can survive. They lived through the Dark Ages, right? You know what kind of culture they had during the Dark Ages, when there was a great thing that hit the moon or whatever, and it was recorded all over the world in all different cultures except Europe. Europe is the only culture so backward that nobody could record a great astronomical event. Pathetic. And so we know what anarchy is like. Anarchy is not having an overarching geographical agreement for the use of force. So everybody has to negotiate use of force privately, individually. We know what that's like. That was the Dark Ages. Okay. Now, so the question that it would come down to in what we're currently talking about with him here, is it the case that breaking the law in the area that you live in could be considered initiation of force as such? Because that's what I would have to say to claim that he can't do that. He can't have his little revolution. Now, if that's true, if just him setting up his little police and force and jail and that in court, if that by itself, he didn't even arrest anybody. He's just setting up his police and courts. He's just got the cars, the guns, the jail. He's just setting it up. If that itself is initiation of force, according to him, then you would have to go and take him out. And although he's done nothing, you would have to initiate force against him. So that can't be initiation of force because he's done nothing. So then you would initiate force against him. So it all comes down to the question of, is that initiation of force? And he says, no, it's clearly not. Even if you say it is, it's not. Well, guess what? If we define it in the law, our consensual lawmakers we elected, who went to our colleges and studied our culture, if we define it in the law as being illegal to say, have your own jail, and we would have in there provisions like false imprisonment, and if you ever put anybody in your jail, that would be false imprisonment. And people who make little private jails in their basement and lock girls up in them do get charged with false imprisonment and do go to prison for that if they get caught. So we've got that covered. Yes, you cannot build a private prison and start a private government because that is an initiation of force. We've just defined it as that. Now imagine if we didn't define it as that. Imagine if we said, oh yes, you can have your own courthouses and your own police forces and your own jails. Everybody, anybody. It's none of our business whether you have these things. That would be a state of anarchy. That is the difference between the Dark Ages in Europe and modern America. So, yes, we would define that as initiation of force to start your own government within another government, and it would reply with force, not by initiating force as he is asserting, but by responding to an initiation of force. He didn't have to go through with arresting anybody and put in his little jail that he built. All he had to do was have enough stuff built so that we could take it to a court of law and prove to a jury that he intended to do something nasty like start arresting people according to his own laws. That's all we have to prove. Take him to a court of his peers, a jury of his peers, and prove that he intended to falsely imprison according to his own... What rules would he choose? Did he do this just for economy, which is what Roy Childs is saying? He did it because he could do it cheaper. He did it just for economy. Really? A social revolution including the use of force and a monopoly on force just so you could save a few bucks? That's really strange because monies and economies happen within the borders of a country. So that's a really strange idea, isn't it? You see how stupid and confused the anarchists are. All right, let's see what we can go forward to. Where are we here? We're not going very fast here. 18 minutes and I'm 4 minutes in. That is not very fast.
Suppose I either decide to set up an institution to attain these ends, or patronise one which a friend or a business colleague has established. Now, if he succeeds in setting up the agency, which provides all the services of the objectivist government, and restricts his more efficient activities to the use of retaliation against aggressors, there are only two alternatives as far as the government is concerned. A, it can use force or the threat of it against the new institution in order to keep its monopoly status in the given territory, thus initiating the use or threat of physical force against one who has not himself initiated force.
See? He says the guy has not himself initiated physical force, but the government coming and stopping him would be. That's where we disagree. By setting up your own little jail and courts and police force and guns and armored cruisers and batons and training and pepper spray and helmets, by setting all that stuff up, you are building up a body of evidence that you intend to break the law, whatever law we've made about false imprisonment and security guards having to be licensed or whatever it is. I don't know whatever laws you choose. But if you do set up something where you have broken the law, yeah, you invite yourself to be put under arrest. And it's an answer to what you've done. You have provoked that behavior. Now, you could have gone out and run for office. You could have written a philosophy textbook. You could have become a professor at the colleges. You could have done lots of things to try to change the society. But instead, you went and built a little brick jailhouse and got a car and some guns and some thugs. That's very strange behavior. And it's because he can't understand the difference between an economy, which happens inside of a government, and the government itself. He gets them conflated. He can't understand what a monopoly is, which is something that happens underneath the protection of governments. He thinks monopolies apply to governments themselves, which is strange because his definition of neither monopoly included anything about defining a government. So, all right, shall we continue?
Obviously then, if it should choose this alternative, it would have initiated force, QED. Or B, it can refrain from initiating force and allow the new institution to carry on its activities without interference. If it did this, then the objectivist government would become a truly marketplace institution, not a government at all. There would be competing agencies of protection, defence and retaliation.
It would be a truly marketplace institution if governments could compete with each other. He's got it mixed up again. That would not be a marketplace. A marketplace occurs underneath and inside the protection of a government. Now, just to show you that that's the case, trade between governments is subject to what? Tariffs and borders. And what do they call that when stuff goes across the borders? It skips my mind at the moment. But they inspect everything. And customs. So that's certainly, it's not trade between countries isn't an economy. The economies happen inside countries. Now, there's some sort of global economy, but you know how fragile that is. The real economies happen within countries. Also, there are border economies that happen across the borders of certain areas of countries. I'm not refuting any of that. I'm just saying that in a given geographical area, the government that sets up the laws in that geographical area dictates what kind of economy is going to occur in that area. And the economy is a secondary derivation. It comes from the government and how the government exercises its monopoly on force, because the government does exercise a monopoly on force. In fact, we could define the government as that entity which exercises a monopoly on force. Roy Childs comes running along and he says, it's immoral to exercise a monopoly on force. So who are you going to counter enforce this thing that you say is right then? So he doesn't want us to have a monopoly on force. So he's going to, okay, let me put it this way. We're willing to enforce our monopoly on force, okay? We're willing to enforce it. Is he willing to enforce his non-monopoly on force? Is he willing to enforce that nobody should have a monopoly on force? Because we're willing to enforce our monopoly on force. This comes down to the question of, do rights exist? Well, come and try to take my money and let's talk about whether rights exist. And I'll call the police and then you can tell them whether rights exist. Or I'll pull my knife out, or maybe I've got a gun. And we'll talk about whether my rights exist if you try to tell me my rights don't exist. Now, they're not a black Cuban in Mecca that we dance around. They're not a physical thing somewhere. But if you come and take me and I shoot you with a bullet and kill you because you try to take my money against my rights, then your argument that rights don't exist is pretty hollow as you lay in your grave. So maybe that would convince Roy. Maybe none of this would convince Roy. I bet none of it would. He just gets his hierarchy mixed up. It's the stolen concept. Ayn Rand described it as a stolen concept. Ignore the fact that you need to have a government in place to consider what is an economy and what is a monopoly, and just talk about economies and monopolies of governments. Well, what if we said economic government? What if we said a monopoly of government? Those things happen underneath governments. They happen inside of governments. They're a derivation of governments. They're a derivation of behavior in a geographical region where somebody has monopolized force. Now, what do you have in a region where no one has monopolized force? According to him, you just have an economy, a free economy of ponies and rainbow poop. All right, how far are we in? God damn it, 5 minutes? This is shaping up to be pretty epic here. Holy crap.
Short, free market anarchism. If the former should occur, the result would be statism. It is important to remember in this context that statism exists whenever there is a government which initiates force. The degree of statism, once the government has done so, is all that is in question. Once the principle of the initiation of force has been accepted. Note also that the question...
So is it initiation of force to just build a government as such? Is that initiation of force? Now, let's also notice that an objective fact about reality is that we don't frequently build new governments, do we? An objective fact about reality is that governments last a long, long time. Decades, even centuries. We don't build them every month or every year or every day, for God's sakes, right? So if we were to think about that fact, let's rewind just a bit and hear what he says in light of that.
Positives, not merely a negation of negatives. But one does, I submit, have a moral obligation to oppose a moral evil such as government, especially when one had previously come out in favour of such an evil. Note also that the question of how free market anarchism would work is secondary to establishing the evil of government. If a limited government, i.e. a non-statist government, is a contradiction in terms, then it cannot be advocated, period.
Alright, well, if you followed what I said before, I hope I followed through on it. I got done 25 minutes, I'm starting to lose focus a little. We better make this part one and let me finish up a little. Now, if you appreciate what I'm doing here, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what kind of stuff I'll be producing over the next few weeks, but I have planned a series on Rome, and who knows what will come out of the woodwork. Victor Pross wants to do an interview with me, and I gave up a job driving used Mercedes and BMWs, and I drove Porsches once in a while, and I drove a Bugatti once, and I drove Alfa Romeo. So that was a terribly, terribly easy job. So please don't allow me to go back to that job. Please go to Patreon and give me $5 a month or $10 a month. And you know, Sam Harris says, what did he say? He says, send me money if you can afford it. He says, if you're the type of person who can go get your coffee when you want a cup of coffee, then send me $5 or $10. If you're the type of person who has trouble buying his coffee, then don't send me the money. That's what Sam Harris said. So I guess he's already got all the people comfortable. So the only people left is probably the people who can't really afford to send $5 unless they give up their coffee. So I guess I'm talking to you people. Give up your coffee tomorrow and use that $5 to give me this month. It's only, your coffee's $5 for one day. You give it to me for the month. If a bunch of you get together and do that, then I can give up my second job. And that's a beautiful thing. Because would you rather have a cup of coffee tomorrow? Some stupid cup of coffee that probably isn't even going to taste very good, and it's going to make you have to take a shit, and then you're going to flush it down the toilet. Or you could take that $5 and send it to me, and I would make more videos. And what would you enjoy more? A Mr. Cropper video or that cup of coffee? And would you rather send that money to Starbucks or to an objectivist? So yeah, sign up for my Patreon and help me to do more videos like this so that I don't have to go drive Mercedeses and BMWs, which is fun, but it's boring. I'd rather sit here and do this. Now, I do have another job which I'm not going to give up unless I get extremely rich, but I can give up my part-time job. Okay, so this is a cop-out right here. He says that what the society would look like in this case of a free market is not his worry. He says he's not a social engineer. Should we let him say it again? And I say that it's a cop-out, but let's hear what he says again here real quick.
Admit have a moral obligation to oppose a moral evil such as government, especially when one had previously come out in favour of such an evil. Note also that the question of how free market anarchism would work is secondary to establishing the evil of government.
The question of how free market anarchism would work is secondary to discussing the evil. Well, let me show you how backwards he has it. The Founding Fathers knew that in order to build this new nation, they were going to have to flush out a lot of details. And they did a project called the Federalist Papers, where they just wrote back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to each other, discussing all manner of different things. They didn't necessarily agree on all of it, but the Federalist Papers are a great foundational document in our nation's history. In fact, I should probably do some videos on some of those papers. I really should do some videos on some of those papers, shouldn't I? In fact, why don't you send me some Patreon money and tell me that you want some videos on those? So, there are great foundational documents explaining how this nation would work and why. And they went through and sifted through ancient Rome and all of the constitutions that Aristotle enumerated, and they looked through a lot of information when they were going over how are we going to build this new country. Do you see what Roy Childs there says? He says that's not a problem. All we need to establish is that coercive government is evil and do away with it, and then the market economy will take care of itself. Now remember that the market only exists inside of a geographical region where somebody has declared a monopoly on force and allowed everybody to get on with their lives without using force as a daily lubricant. Okay, that's what a market is. And he wants to apply that concept to the use of force as such. That's how confused and backwards the anarchists are. That's how crazy they are. Okay, so he's admitting that his philosophy is a mess. He's admitting that he's probably looked at the ideas, he's probably familiar with other thinkers on these, and he can't work it out. There's too many details, it's too confusing. He admits that. He says we'll just have to figure it out after the fact. Now that sounds a lot like communism, right? Let's just go forward with the truth, armed with the truth, right? And free ourselves from coercion and evil. And then it might seem like it'll be a mess to us now, but once we get there, it'll be fine. We'll work it all out. This is like diving into the proverbial thorn bush, because why not? Why is it any better than walking around it? Fascism is a thorn bush, and capitalism is walking around the thorn bush. And you dive into it, and you say all the way, right? Even as you're starting to get cut, you're singing, "This is so fantastic," and then you die in large numbers. It's terrible. That's what he's setting it up for. That's what he would. That's what he would bring. He would say, "Let's just forget about the government, wipe the government out, and let's just have an economy." What is an economy? All right, ladies and gentlemen, patronize me. I'll probably do another video. Geez, we're at 7 minutes and 56 seconds out of 26 minutes. Do you think we need another video on this? We do. I mean, I've got another page and a half of notes here, so we'll be doing another installment.